views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of Bronxnet or the program underwriters.
All right, coming up on this edition of Today's Verdict, when a child is abused, the emotional scars can last a lifetime. The law does offer protections, but sadly, most do not know where to turn. Today, we'll meet with a well-known trial attorney who will help those suffering achieve justice. Next up, identity theft is the #1 threat to your hard-earned money. How do you protect yourself and what legal protections exist? We meet with an expert on set to guide us through the digital pitfalls we all face when it comes to protecting our identity. And finally, getting married is an exciting stage in your life, but there are many legal steps which you should consider. Stay tuned for an attorney who will guide us through prenuptial agreements. As you can see, we have much to get to, so stay tuned. Today's Verdict starts right now. All right, hello, welcome to Today's Verdict, a live and interactive show that gives you your legal rights and options. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. Well, Today's Verdict is always encouraging you to stay connected. Make sure to tweet us at Today's Verdict and hashtag Ask Today's Verdict if you have a question. Also, make sure to like us and follow us on Facebook at Today's Verdict and check us out at Bronxnet.tv. A child who is sexually abused lives with the ramifications for years. There are legal protections, and returning to our studio is well-known trial attorney and past president of the New York State Trial Attorneys, David Otto. David, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
You know, this particular topic, and I think I mentioned to you offset, seems to be a topic that jurors really like to wrap themselves around as opposed to maybe just an automobile accident cases. They take these cases very seriously. Do you find that this seems to be an area of the law that seems to be growing?
Well, I think when you're talking about jurors and the ability to understand, I think everybody could understand that when a child is sexually abused, that's devastating. And that has, the long-term impact, it can't be overstated. It is something that, people understand that a child is the most vulnerable, at the most vulnerable time in their lives, at the formative years, and the damage that is done from sexual abuse of a child is something that everybody can understand, I think.
Let's take a step back, because I know there have been changes in the law. And before we get to what the changes are, in the past, if somebody wanted to pursue a claim, what was the remedy with respect to these types of issues? And we're talking about abuse of a child. We're not talking really about a neglect case where somebody doesn't feed a child. We're talking about a sexual abuse case, correct?
Correct.
So tell me where we would stand in these types of cases in the past.
Okay, prior to February of last year, the victim of a child sexual abuse case would have either 1 year or 5 years to bring a lawsuit against the perpetrator. In February of 2019, Governor Cuomo signed the Child Victims Act, which extended the statute of limitations to bring these lawsuits for a period up to when the survivor is 55 years old.
Now, why? Where did that come from? Did the pressure come from for this to really take shape?
Well, it was really, as time went on, thankfully, we've learned a lot about what victims go through. And we learned that child sex abuse victims and survivors don't come forward, and we know now why, and we know how difficult it is for a variety of reasons. The perpetrators of these crimes are people in positions of authority. They're people in positions of power. Children, 11, 12, 13, feel shame. They don't want to tell their parents. They don't want to tell anybody. They're going to feel like they'll be ostracized.
And some of them, don't they also block it out so that maybe they don't even remember it happened because they don't want to remember it happened, and yet something triggers the memory?
It is so horrific. The experience is so horrific that it's suppressed. And by suppressing it, what we see are these survivors, whether it be severe depression, like I said, anxiety, or self-medication through substance abuse,
Sure.
very, very common. So yes, you're 100% right. It's, we've learned a lot through the years about this. So.
Where do the cases seem to be coming from? Are they church-related, school-related, step-parent related? Where do you see in your practice most of these types of cases? Where do they emanate from generally?
Well, before the Child Victims Act, we saw they come from a variety of places. They come from the family. They can come from close friends or distant relatives. And again, from any institution, a school, a church, a synagogue. But the cases after the Child Victims Act extended the statute, we see a lot of places of worship, private schools.
Places of worship.
Mm-hmm.
In the past, big cover-up, right? How did they get away with that? How did the priests continue to do this when the powers that be knew that this was happening? How was it swept under the rug?
I wish I had I have an answer as to how, but why I don't know.
Let's start with how.
Yeah, how. Complaints were ignored. There's clearly a pattern of turning a blind eye to complaints. There are incidents where the perpetrator, when the school or the parish or the synagogue, whoever, finds out about it or has an inkling that there's a pedophile amongst them, they either cover it up or they, to save embarrassment for the school, or they may ship them off to another school or parish.
Which leads me to the issue of how can you resurrect these cases if you're now allowed to bring lawsuits for issues concerning abuse that happened in the 1950s or the 1960s. How could you even figure out who was working there, who records? How do you do that, really?
Yeah, I mean, we vet these cases, we investigate these cases very thoroughly, and you go back, you speak with former classmates, you speak with people who worked at the school, if you're going back into the 50s, that's a different story. It's a little more difficult. But once you get into the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, there are.
So you can do it.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
You're taking this type of case. Do you try a lot of them? Do they have to go to verdict? Can you settle the cases? Do they move them?
We haven't, because the Child Victims Act is so new, those cases really haven't been tried at this point. But in the past, child sex abuse cases, you have to remember, because of what you mentioned, that jurors are very sensitive to this kind of thing, and for the other reason that victims and survivors of child sex abuse aren't really willing to want to go to trial and to testify. The case is usually resolved.
Now, procedurally, there's been a way to be able to bring the case now so it's not in the child's name, right? Tell us a
Correct.
little bit about that, because that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And we're very fortunate to have an administrative judge here in the city of New York who understands the issue here and allowed and issued an order to allow these survivors of sexual abuse to bring their lawsuits anonymously. So their names are not on any documents that are filed.
There could be some shame, personal shame. They shouldn't be, but there is. And unfortunately, and this way it gives them a chance to stay under the radar.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have clients who are, have become presidents of banks, or have families now, or but then we also have clients who have had a life of substance abuse and misery
and unhappiness because of it.
So either way, proceeding anonymous is
tips. Someone's watching. Unfortunately, they may know somebody, or they themselves have been a victim of sexual abuse.
What's important to know, David, and I wanted to mention earlier about the statute of limitations.
Yes,
Statute of limitations, very, very important in any lawsuit, in a civil case, as you know, because it's a set period of time that you have to bring a lawsuit. And if you miss that period of time, you're forever barred from bringing that lawsuit.
So the biggest tip is to make sure you get to you, and you get to you quickly.
Yeah.
So because we don't want your statute is running. That's
Right.
the most important thing.
And
Any other tips?
And on these cases,
Yeah.
it's very, very important for your viewers to know that it allows a survivor of child sexual abuse to file a lawsuit no matter how old you are now, and no matter how long ago the abuse occurred.
Okay, very quickly, where do we find you?
You can find me at Otto and Babbitt
Okay.
at 8 West 38th Street
right.
in Manhattan.
And you're going to come back 2
I
times. We'll make
absolutely
you
will.
three times the charm.
I appreciate it.
All right, hang on.
Thank
All
you.
right, we have to take a quick break, but don't worry, we'll be back with more Today's Verdict right after this. All right, welcome back to Today's Verdict. I'm your host, David Lesch. We are always encouraging you to stay connected. Tweet us at Today's Verdict. Well, the internet has provided us with conveniences, but certainly the threat of losing our identity is not one of them. Well, luckily, we have attorney Daniel Schlanger here to guide us through the protections afforded us under the law. So, Daniel, this scares me. I have to tell you, not too many things do, but identity theft scares me because it could happen to any one of us any day. Is this something that seems to be growing, or do we finally have it under control?
I think, unfortunately, it's grown tremendously, and it's continuing to grow. And the simple reason is that our data is everywhere now. There's ubiquitous credit card use. There's, people are constantly paying for things online, putting their information out there for legitimate purposes, and it's hugely convenient, but it comes with a risk.
Listen, I just recently gave my credit card in to buy a drink, and 2 days later, the Broadway tickets were charged on my account. So it can happen anywhere or any place.
We actually represent victims who have that problem, where the credit card company, unfortunately, just doesn't
believe you.
doesn't believe you and doesn't agree to credit you back.
Well, Daniel, let me ask you a question. Is it credit cards, Social Security cards, driver's license? Where is it? Is it a mixture of all three? Where are they getting you?
What we see most of in my practice are credit cards and ATM cards and other sorts of points of purchase transactions.
Stolen directly from the machine, or from the person who decides to write down the digits after you've given them the credit card?
It can be stolen in a number of ways. So one way is online hacking.
Okay.
Another way is where someone actually steals your wallet and steals, your credit card and other information that you have on you physically. And another is, as you described, someone who has access to your credit card. And so the issue isn't so much that they've stolen your identity and opened a new account, it's that they've put unauthorized transfers on an account that they had access to. It can really, and there's also credit card skimmers, which I don't know if you've ever been unfortunate enough
What
to.
does that mean? Because I've heard the term, but I don't necessarily know what that means.
So there are devices that thieves can put onto when you put your card into a machine to run it, like at the gas station.
Like a chip.
Well,
Well, this would be like a strip.
a strip, and
Okay.
they grab the information off the card as it passes through the machine.
I understand.
And then are able to essentially make a false card or
All right.
use a false card.
So let's move us to the point where we now think there's been an issue. And by the way, when do we usually figure out there's an issue? What's our first aha moment? My identity has been stolen.
It varies. One common scenario is that for identity theft victims is they start to get, if it's unauthorized use on a card, is they get a bill that has an enormous charge on it. Another scenario, unfortunately, is they start getting contacted by debt collectors or creditors who think that they're calling a legitimate debt, a debtor who legitimately owes them money, and the person says, well, wait a second, I don't actually have a car loan, so I don't know what this is about. And sometimes it's through the credit report, either because they pull their credit report on their own.
Right. Which credit report? Because some viewers don't even understand what that means. They just know there are credit reports, but we're talking about agencies that do this, right? Just walk us through that very quickly.
Sure. So the ones that folks have heard of typically are Experian and Equifax and TransUnion, and they're gathering and compiling data about your use of credit from a wide variety of sources. And for our purposes, the most relevant ones here are from lenders, credit card companies, and other loan servicers, that sort of thing. And they compile all of that information, and then you can look at it. They compile it into a report that you can view. It also that information is used to generate your credit score. So when a lender is trying to assess whether they should extend you credit or on what terms they should extend you credit, they can look at this report and figure out, are you somebody who qualifies for the product that they're considering offering you?
Okay, so now unfortunately, you got a bum credit report because of what happened to you, and somebody needs to clear their name, and that's when they see you, right?
Well,
or tell me, is that basically what you try and do for them?
so the first step is to dispute it, and a lot of with the credit reporting agencies, and that you can do without a lawyer. And let me just say, because this is a mistake people very often make, when you dispute it, a lot of people think that because the issue is an account with Discover Card or whoever that doesn't exist, that to protect their rights, all they need to do is dispute it with the Discover Card or whoever. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, to trigger all of the protections you have under the Act, you need to dispute it with the bureaus, with Experian and TransUnion.
All three of them.
Whoever's reporting it.
Okay.
And when you do that, they then have a legal obligation to investigate your dispute, which means now if they if they perform an unreasonable investigation, they have legal liability, and that typically is where my firm comes in.
And what do you do? How do you do that? Letters, lawsuits, where does that even go?
Sure. So the dispute letter, sometimes people very often have trouble doing valid or compelling disputes. So sometimes the first step is to help the consumer redispute the item and provide the proofs that would make it a reasonable investigator have to conclude that this wasn't you. Police reports, affidavits, records of where you were on the day in question, that sort of thing. But once that doesn't work, then the answer is you have to sue them in order to vindicate.
Where do you sue
your
them?
rights.
State, federal, both?
Typically federal court.
Federal court. All right.
The Fair Credit Reporting Act is a federal law, and if we're talking about a credit card company as well as a bureau, very often you have two entities. You have the credit card, so you have the credit reporting agency that didn't perform a real investigation and just said, no, we think we're going to leave it on. And you have the credit card company or the lender who just, when they were asked by the bureau what's going on with this, just sort of cursorily or summarily said, yes, the person owes it. They both have liability.
What's the best tip, because we don't have too much time, best tip you would give somebody quickly if they think that they were a victim of identity theft?
Dispute it immediately over the phone, dispute it in writing, and pull your credit report.
And where do we find you?
Consumerprotection.net.
Okay, and you'll come back?
Absolutely.
That's what I like. All right. We have to take a quick break, but we'll be back right after this. Prenuptial agreement is a common legal step taken before marriage. This helps establish the property and financial rights of each spouse in the event of a divorce. We're here to guide us through the process is attorney John Teufel. John, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much, David.
Prenuptial agreements can be a little bit of a touchy subject between two people who love each other and are ready to walk down the aisle, but I assume you highly recommend it.
I do. I am. I tend to be a very pro prenup person, and not all matrimonial lawyers are that way. But I do strongly favor getting a prenup.
All
Yeah.
right. The one thing that I remember about prenuptial agreements is that you kind of have to get to them fairly quickly once you and your spouse-to-be have decided to do one, because they can become a little contentious,
Yes, that's
right?
true.
And that would lead to, you know, a tough time walking down the aisle. Am I correct?
Yes, that's 100% correct. You wouldn't believe how many people have contacted me literally a week, 3 days before the wedding and said, we've been putting this off for months. Guess what? We need a prenup. And then you work around the clock
To get it done.
to get it done. It is, but you're right, it can get very contentious. And for that reason, yeah, have the conversation as soon as you realize you want one and speak to lawyers.
All right,
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about what is in a prenup.
Sure.
All right, let's talk about the guts of it. What generally goes into the contract?
So you can put as much or as little as you want into a prenup, with a few exceptions. Very common would be how property would be distributed in the event of a divorce. In other words, whether everything that comes into the marriage just gets split, it belongs to both of you, or whether you want to keep certain things in one spouse's name, certain things in the other spouse's name. So that's a very common thing. Alimony, hugely common to put in a prenup.
In alimony, we're talking about like spousal support.
Spousal
what you
support,
would
maintenance.
What you would pay out to your spouse in the event of a divorce over a certain amount of years or something, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the
Okay.
reason that that is good to put into a prenup is because New York has a statutory formula that is presumptively correct when you get divorced. And that formula doesn't work for every circumstance, right? It can result in either a way too high alimony amount, way too low alimony amount. And so if you set it in your prenup, then presumably if your marriage ever ends, which, you know, no marriages ever do, but
No, never. They all go right
they
to the
all
end.
go right to the
There's
very
no
end.
50% divorce rate.
No,
That's
of course
someplace,
not.
That's
of
all
course
someplace
not.
else.
Right. Then this prenup will go into effect, and you won't have to argue about it. So it's very useful.
Kids.
Kids,
You don't have any kids, but you're going to have some kids.
yeah. So nothing about custody, which in a lot of divorces can be a hugely contentious topic,
But let's say,
can go into a prenup.
Look, they say, look, we're getting married. You've been pushing me for a while. I wasn't really going to do it, but I want to get married now. Only if we do get divorced, I get full custody of our children.
Won't
do
be
that.
upheld. Won't be upheld.
Can't do
If
it.
at the end of that marriage you tried to have a court uphold that, the court would say, no, I'm sorry. First of all, the children weren't in existence at the time of the contract. And second of all, child custody is ultimately determined by the best interest of the child.
How about this one? Look, I take my religion very, very seriously. I know you're Catholic. I'm Jewish. Kids get raised Jewish. We've got to put that in there.
Again, it's not going to be upheld because the best interests of the child are what will determine who is going to have custody of the child.
What about some issues like life insurance or things to protect if, God forbid, you pass or your spouse passes? Do those things go in there?
Yes, absolutely. And that brings up a very interesting point. You can structure certain obligations during the marriage
right.
with a prenuptial agreement.
Give me an example.
So life insurance would be a great example, that one spouse has to carry a certain amount of life insurance throughout the marriage, or in the event that they die, so that their spouse and potential children are protected. So that would be a very good example of that. If you wanted to really get into like the nitty-gritty stuff, you can do that in a prenup, although I typically don't recommend it. But you could say, for example, wife will pay husband $800 a month in rent. You could
can
put
do
that
that.
in a prenup, and that will be able to be upheld.
But
yeah.
but I would assume you can't say things like, vaguely remember this. You can't say, well, my spouse, male or female, has to do housework or cleaning around the house, that type of thing, because people
Yeah.
have tried to put that into prenups.
Yeah.
You're obligated to do this for me or that. You can't do that, can you?
You know, I've never actually read a case where something like that came into play. There are cases, I mean, this is a little bit, people have heard of it, adultery clauses.
That's right. Adultery,
Yeah.
celebrities have these adultery clauses.
Right,
Is
right.
that true?
Yeah, you can do that. Yes, I have seen prenuptial agreements that have adultery clauses in them, and they will probably, if everything else checks out, be upheld by a court. Yes. Mhm.
Let's talk about the representation of a client, because these things can go sour if somebody's not represented. Am I correct? Tell me how it works.
Absolutely. So if someone comes to me and says, I want a prenuptial agreement, I make sure, I say, talk to your spouse, because I'm not allowed to talk to them directly. Talk to your spouse and say, go get an attorney. Number one, having two attorneys deal with the messiness of it, it's just so much easier. If I, as a lawyer, am dealing with a spouse, it can get personal, it can get... Let the lawyers handle all the ugliness. Number two, there can be issues about having that prenuptial agreement upheld if one spouse is not represented.
And you can bet if there's a divorce or a nasty divorce and somebody ends up having more money than the other, somebody may want to invalidate that prenup.
100%. And you can imagine that the other spouse would then say, I wasn't even represented. I didn't know what I was
Which leads
signing."
me to the issue of duress.
Yes.
You know, and you know, as you get closer and closer to the date of marriage, let's say 2 days before, you know, I say to my spouse, you know, I'm kind of getting cold feet here. I know you invited all, you know, 200 people. You want this to go forward still? You sign a prenup. Now, the spouse, what am I going to do now? Invitations are out, family's coming, I spent all this money. Fine, just give me the thing and I'll sign it.
Yeah.
But that's not okay, is it?
Well, you know, it's a little tricky because that is so unfair, and I would never recommend a client do that. However, New York is a very prenup-friendly state, and New York is willing to let people structure, these are two adults, structure their own lives, their own married lives and their own finances. Just that alone may or may not be enough to get a prenup invalidated. If it's also a horribly unfair prenup that deprives the other spouse of any rights to share in the marital wealth, then that very well could get overturned.
And I assume it has to be signed and initialed in pages.
In a very formal manner,
right,
yes,
as
correct.
if it's a will, okay?
Correct.
Tips, somebody's watching today and they're on the fence. Well, maybe get a prenup, not get a prenup. What do you have to say to that?
I would say talk to your spouse. Have that conversation, because people put it off because it's not a pleasant conversation to have. But you know what? When you're getting married, you're going to have a lot of unpleasant conversations, and couples need to be able to talk about finances.
You know what? And if they love you enough and this is so important to you, then, you know, maybe
Then you
can
work it out.
Work it out, right?
Exactly.
All right, where do we find you? Let's say somebody needs a prenup and they want to get to you.
Sure. Just shoot me an email. It's john@johntuffelesq.com. I'd be happy to talk to you.
All right, and unfortunately, January, I think, is the biggest month for divorce.
It is. That's true.
All right, so let's start it in the right year with a prenup.
Yes.
All right, hang out. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our guests for joining us, and of course you, the viewers, for watching. If you missed any part of today's show, be sure to check it out at www.bronxnet.tv. Also remember, if there's a legal issue or topic you'd like to see on a future edition of Today's Verdict, feel free to contact me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org or tweet us at Today's Verdict, and make sure to hashtag Ask Today's Verdict. For myself and all of us at the studio, as always, remember, know your rights, know your issues, reach your verdict. We'll see you next time.